Hello everyone, and welcome to my General Hospital official channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up.
The air in the courtroom was thick, heavy with a silence that seemed to absorb all sound, leaving only the faint, rhythmic ticking of the clock on the mahogany-paneled wall as a marker of the time that was about to be stolen. Every breath Willow Tate drew felt labored, filtered through the stifling atmosphere of judgment and finality. She sat ramrod straight at the defense table, her hands clasped so tightly together in her lap that the knuckles shone white, small islands of bone against the taut skin. Her lawyer, a well-meaning man with a perpetually worried crease between his brows, occasionally leaned over to whisper platitudes she could no longer hear. The words were just vibrations in the air, meaningless noises drowned out by the roaring in her own ears. This was the end of the line. The culmination of a catastrophic sequence of events that had begun with a single, desperate choice and spiraled into a legal nightmare. The trial had been a public spectacle, her life, her mistakes, her fears, her reasons, picked apart and displayed for the entertainment of the curious and the condemnation of the righteous. The prosecution had painted her as a cunning, manipulative figure, a woman who had knowingly and willingly plunged her hands into the murky waters of corporate espionage. They had stripped her actions of context, of the desperate motivation that had clawed at her insides, the need to save her younger sister, whose mounting medical bills were a tidal wave threatening to drown their small family. Now, all that was left was the sentencing. The judge, an elderly man with a face like a crumpled map of a harsh country and eyes that held no discernible emotion, shuffled papers before him. His name was Judge Morrow, and his reputation for being unforgiving, particularly in cases involving breaches of trust, preceded him like a cold draft. Willow kept her gaze fixed on the grain of the wooden bench in front of her, tracing the swirling patterns, trying to lose herself in their chaotic, yet ordered, paths. It was a futile attempt to anchor herself to something, anything, other than the precipice on which she stood. In the public gallery, just a few rows behind her, sat Drew. Drew, her former lover, her confidant, the man she had believed was her anchor in the tumultuous sea of her life. Drew, who had also been her superior at the powerful and vindictive media conglomerate, Newman Ladrop. His presence was a physical weight against her back, a constant, painful reminder of the second, more profound betrayal that had sealed her fate. It wasn't just the company she had wronged, it was him, personally. And Drew was not a man who took personal slights lightly. He sat with an unnerving stillness, impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that screamed of power and money. His expression was unreadable, a carefully constructed mask of detached observation. But Willow, who had once known every flicker of his eyelids, every subtle twitch of his lips, could feel the cold fury radiating from him. He was here not for closure, not for support, but to witness her fall. To see the final act of the drama he had, in many ways, directed. Willow Tate, please rise, Judge Morrow's voice cut through the silence, sharp and authoritative. The sound of her own name was a physical blow. For a terrifying second, her legs refused to obey the command. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and the ornate lights of the courtroom seemed to swim in her vision. With a monumental effort that seemed to draw from the very last reserves of her strength, she pushed back her chair and stood. The floor felt unsteady beneath her feet. She forced her eyes to meet the judge's, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Willow Tate, Judge Morrow began, his voice echoing in the hushed room, you have been found guilty by a jury of your peers on multiple counts of theft of intellectual property, breach of fiduciary duty, and corporate espionage. The evidence presented during this trial was both compelling and damning. You exploited a position of trust within a major corporation for personal gain, showing a blatant disregard for the law and for the ethical standards that bind our commercial institutions. He paused, letting the words hang in the air, each one a stone added to the weight crushing her chest. Personal gain. If only it were that simple. If only it had been for a luxury car or a vacation home. The truth, the desperate, ugly truth of a sister's failing health and a system that demanded payment for survival, had been dismissed as a convenient excuse. The court recognizes the arguments put forth by your counsel regarding mitigating circumstances, the judge continued, though his tone suggested he found them anything but mitigating. However, the scale of the theft, the sophistication of the operation, and the significant financial and reputational damage inflicted upon Newman Ladrop cannot be overlooked. A message must be sent. A message that this kind of calculated deception will be met with the full force of the law. He adjusted his glasses, his gaze boring into her. The sentence of this court is that you be incarcerated for a period of no less than 4 years in a federal correctional institution. 4 years. The number detonated in the space between them, its shockwave hitting Willow with physical force. A small, choked sound escaped her lips, a gasp that was barely audible but which echoed like a gunshot in the profound silence of her own being. 4 years. 1,460 days. 35,040 hours. It was an abstraction, a number too vast to comprehend, yet it defined the immediate boundaries of her entire existence. Her youth, her future, her chance to be there for her sister, all of it, reduced to this stark, unimaginable span of time. The world seemed to narrow, the edges of her vision darkening. She was aware of her lawyer's hand on her arm, a steadying pressure she barely felt. She was aware of a muffled sob from somewhere in the gallery, her aunt, perhaps? She couldn't turn to look. Her body was frozen, locked in the moment of impact. Her mind, however, was racing, a frantic, desperate animal seeking an escape that did not exist. Images flashed behind her eyes, her sister's smile, the sterile smell of a hospital room, the cold, sleek interface of the Newman Ladrop server she had accessed, the devastating moment Drew had discovered the truth. The formalities continued around her, the judge speaking words about her right to appeal, about the forfeiture of certain assets, but it was all a distant hum. The gavel fell with a crack that was both definitive and terrifying, the sound ringing out like the slamming of a great, iron door. It was over. The bailiffs moved toward her, their steps measured and firm. The familiar, sickening feeling of cold metal encircled her wrists as the handcuffs were clicked into place. The sound was final. It was the sound of a life ending. As she was turned, her legs moving on autopilot, her eyes swept across the public gallery. They found Drew's immediately. It was as if an invisible thread, taut and humming with negative energy, connected them. He had risen from his seat and was now standing in the aisle, a stark, imposing figure amidst the shifting crowd. People were beginning to file out, casting curious, pitying, or satisfied glances her way, but Drew remained motionless, his gaze fixed on her. The bailiffs began to lead her down the central aisle toward the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom, the doors that led out of this arena of justice and into the bowels of the system, to a holding cell, to a prison transport van, to a new and terrifying reality. With each step she took toward him, the air grew colder. He didn't move, didn't flinch. He simply waited, a predator who had finally cornered his prey. As she drew level with him, the procession halted for a brief, agonizing moment, a bailiff adjusted his grip, someone moved in front of them. It was in that suspended sliver of time that Drew took one deliberate step forward, closing the distance between them. He was so close she could smell the faint, clean scent of his cologne, a scent that had once been a source of comfort and was now the aroma of her ruin. He leaned in, his voice a low, venomous whisper meant for her ears alone. It was not loud, but every syllable was carved from ice and laced with a contempt so profound it stole the last vestiges of air from her lungs. He spoke 7 words. 7 simple, devastating words that would be seared into her memory, playing on a continuous, torturous loop for the countless days and nights to come. I hope it was worth it, little traitor. Then, he pulled back, his expression unchanging, a cold, hard sculpture of triumph and disdain. He didn't wait for a response, didn't need one. He had delivered his final blow. He turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing confidently on the marble floor, disappearing into the world of freedom and light, leaving her in the chilling shadow of his condemnation. The bailiffs nudged her forward, and she stumbled, the physical motion nothing compared to the internal collapse. The heavy doors swung open, and she was led through them, the world of the courtroom, the world of her old life, disappearing behind her. The corridor was sterile, lit by harsh fluorescent lights that buzzed overhead. The air smelled of industrial cleaner and despair. They processed her with an efficiency that was dehumanizing. Fingerprints, photographs, the removal of her personal effects, a simple bracelet, her earrings, each item placed in a bag felt like a piece of her identity being stripped away. She was given the coarse, drab uniform of an inmate. The fabric was rough against her skin, a constant, tactile reminder of her new status. She was no longer Willow Tate, the ambitious, if flawed, young professional. She was inmate Tate, a number, a case file, a body to be managed. The transport to the correctional facility was a blur of grim landscapes seen through reinforced, tinted windows. The van was cold, the seats hard. The other women in the van with her were silent, lost in their own private hells. Willow replayed the scene in the courtroom over and over, but it always ended the same way, with Drew's face, close to hers, and those 7 words. "I hope it was worth it, little traitor." The words were a masterpiece of psychological cruelty. They were not an expression of anger. Anger was hot, messy, and could eventually cool. This was colder, more calculated. "I hope," a phrase that pretended to grant a wish, but was in fact a curse. It placed the burden of justification squarely on her, forcing her to weigh 4 years of her life against the reason she had done it. The money, the act, the betrayal. He reduced her complex, desperate motivation to a single, transactional "it was worth it," the most devastating part. This questioned the very core of her sacrifice. Had saving her sister been worth losing her freedom, her reputation, her future? He was forcing her to confront the terrible calculus of her own actions, to doubt her own reasons at the very moment she needed them to be her rock. And then the coup de grace, little traitor. The diminutive little was a deliberate attempt to infantilize her, to strip her of any power or agency, to make her feel small and insignificant. Traitor was the label, the brand he was searing onto her soul. It wasn't just that she had broken the law, she had betrayed him. In his eyes, and in the narrative he had successfully crafted, her crime was personal. It was a violation of their relationship, a rejection of the trust and opportunity he had given her. He had made it about himself, and in doing so, had absolved himself of any role he might have played in pushing her to such extremes. The prison gates clanged shut behind the van with a sound of terrifying finality. Ironheart Women's Correctional Facility was a sprawling complex of bleak, gray buildings surrounded by razor wire that glinted menacingly in the weak sunlight. The intake process was another layer of the nightmare, more paperwork, medical examinations, a shower under the watchful eye of a stoic guard, and the assignment to a cell. Her cell was a small, rectangular space that smelled of disinfectant and the faint, lingering odor of countless previous occupants. The bunk beds were metal, the mattress thin and lumpy. A small, stainless steel sink and toilet stood in one corner. A single, narrow window, reinforced with wire, offered a sliver of a view of another gray wall. This was home. This was where she would eat, sleep, and breathe for the next 4 years. The first days were a numbing cycle of fear, disorientation, and a profound, aching loneliness. The prison was a world with its own brutal rules, its own hierarchies and dangers. The other inmates watched her with a mixture of indifference and curiosity. She was a new fish, and she would have to learn to swim in these treacherous waters quickly. She kept to herself, speaking only when necessary, her mind a fortress under siege, with Drew's 7 words as the enemy's constant, shouted mantra from beyond the walls. The routine was relentless. Wake-up calls at dawn, head counts, meals in a cavernous, noisy cafeteria where the clatter of trays and the low murmur of voices were a constant assault. Work detail in the prison laundry, where the humid, soapy air was thick and the hours were long and monotonous. The only respite was the hour of yard time, where she could walk in a cramped, concrete courtyard, looking up at the same small patch of sky, feeling the vast, uncaring distance between her and everything she had ever known. She thought of her sister constantly. The guilt was a physical pain, a knot in her stomach that never loosened. Had it been worth it? The money she had stolen, passed through intermediaries, had paid for the experimental treatment. Her sister was in remission, her health stabilizing. Her family, while horrified by Willow's actions and the public scandal, had not abandoned her. They wrote letters, visited when they could, their faces pale and drawn with a mixture of love and shame. They never said the words, but she could see the question in their eyes, too. Was it worth it? Drew had planted a seed of doubt that was now taking root in every corner of her life. The letters from her sister were both a balm and a source of fresh agony. They were filled with news of recovery, of small victories, of gratitude. "You saved my life, Willow," she wrote. But reading those words in the grim confines of her cell, surrounded by the sounds of incarceration, they felt like a condemnation. She had traded one life for another. She had secured her sister's future by setting her own ablaze. Was that a fair trade? Was any trade ever fair when it involved a human soul? Drew's words became the lens through which she viewed her entire past relationship with him. She saw now the subtle signs of his controlling nature, the way he had isolated her from other friends at work, the way his generosity had always come with invisible strings attached. He had not loved her, he had possessed her. Her crime, in his eyes, was not just the theft of data, but the theft of herself from him. She had asserted her own will, her own desperate need, over his dominion. Her treason was an act of independence, and for a man like Drew, that was the ultimate, unforgivable sin. Months bled into a year. The sharp, jagged edges of her pain began, imperceptibly, to smooth over, not because the hurt was gone, but because she was learning to carry its weight. She made a few cautious acquaintances. There was Maria, a woman in her 40s doing a long stretch for white-collar crime, who had a quiet, philosophical demeanor. And there was Chloe, a fiery young woman whose mistakes had been born of poverty and lack of options, not corporate ambition. They were not friends, not in the way she understood friendship, but they were allies in survival. She started using the prison library, a small, dusty room with outdated books. She read everything she could get her hands on: history, philosophy, psychology. She was searching for something, though she didn't know what. Absolution? Understanding? A way to dismantle the power of those 7 words that still echoed in her dreams. One day, she found a book on cognitive behavioral therapy. It talked about reframing thoughts, about challenging the automatic, negative narratives that can take hold of a person's mind. As she read, she began to see Drew's words for what they were: a weapon. A sophisticated, cruel, and highly effective psychological weapon designed to keep her in a state of perpetual self-flagellation. He wasn't in the cell with her, but through those words, he had ensured that a part of him always would be. A slow, simmering anger began to replace the crushing weight of despair. It was a clean anger, different from the toxic shame she had been carrying. She was angry at Drew, not just for turning her in, but for this final, insidious act of emotional violence. She was angry at a system that could so easily crush a person for a desperate act born of love, while the architects of vast, systemic injustices often walked free. Her crime was tangible, provable. Theirs was often abstract, hidden in layers of legal complexity. She started to write. In a small, lined notebook she purchased from the commissary, she began to pour out her story. Not the sanitized version from the trial, but the real one. The fear for her sister, the feeling of being trapped, the subtle coercion of her relationship with Drew, the moment of her fateful decision, the shock of discovery, the chilling theater of the trial, and the 7 words that had haunted her. She wrote it all down, giving voice to the pain, giving shape to the monster so she could see it clearly and, perhaps, learn to defeat it. In writing, she began to reframe the question Drew had forced upon her. Was it worth it? Was the wrong question. It was a trap. The right question was, what now? She could not change the past. She could not give back the 4 years. But she could decide what the woman who emerged from this place would be made of. Would she be defined by Drew's label of little traitor, broken and ashamed? Or would she be defined by her own understanding of her actions, flawed, desperate, but ultimately driven by a love so fierce she was willing to sacrifice everything for it? The 2nd year was a turning point. She enrolled in a correspondence course for paralegal studies, using what little money she had saved. The work was challenging, but it gave her a sense of purpose, a thread connecting her to a future beyond the razor wire. She started helping other inmates with their legal appeals, using her sharp mind and newfound knowledge to navigate the Byzantine complexities of the justice system. She found a strange sense of purpose in fighting for others, even in small ways, within the system that had confined her. She learned about resilience. She learned that strength was not the absence of fear or pain, but the determination to keep putting one foot in front of the other even when every part of you screamed to give up. She learned that the walls of a prison could confine a body, but they did not have to confine a mind. Drew's words had been an attempt to build a prison within her mind, one that would hold her long after the physical gates were opened. Her work now was to dismantle that internal prison, brick by painful brick. She thought of him less often, and when she did, the image was less potent. He was no longer a demon haunting her, but simply a man, a cruel, flawed, and ultimately small man who had wielded power carelessly. His victory over her was temporary. He had the satisfaction of the courtroom, but she was the one in the crucible, being forged into something new, something stronger. He was static, frozen in his bitterness. She was changing, evolving. The letters from her sister continued to be her lifeline. Her sister was thriving, building a life, always reminding Willow that she was waiting for her. "We will have a future, Willow. Together." This was the narrative she chose to cling to, the one that slowly overwrote Drew's curse. As the end of her sentence drew nearer, a new kind of anxiety set in. The world outside was a terrifying prospect. How would she find a job? Who would hire an ex-con? How would she rebuild the relationships that had been strained by her incarceration? The familiar walls of Iron Heart, for all their horror, had become a perverse sort of comfort. They represented a known quantity. On the day of her release, the process was as efficient and impersonal as her intake had been. She was given back the clothes she had worn to court 3 years and 9 months earlier. They hung loosely on her thinner frame. She signed papers, was given a small bus fare and a check for the meager wages she had earned in the laundry. The heavy gates swung open, and she stepped through them into the blinding light of a free morning. The air smelled different. It was clean, unfiltered, and vast. The sounds of the city, distant traffic, a bird singing, the wind rustling leaves, were almost overwhelming. She stood for a long moment, just breathing, feeling the sun on her face, a sensation she had almost forgotten. Her family was there, waiting. Her sister broke from the small group and ran to her, wrapping her in a fierce, sobbing hug. The feel of her sister's arms around her, the solid, healthy reality of her, was the final answer to the question that had tormented her for so long. In that embrace, Drew's words finally lost their power. They were just words, spoken by a bitter man in a moment of petty triumph. They held no truth about her character, no prophecy for her future. The journey home was quiet. She looked out the window at the world rushing by, a world that had moved on without her. It was daunting, but it was also filled with possibility. She was not the same woman who had been led away in handcuffs. That woman had been defined by desperation and fear. The woman returning was defined by survival, by a hard-won understanding, and by a love that had endured the darkest of trials. Drew's 7 words were now a part of her history, a scar. But a scar is not an open wound, it is evidence of healing. It is a reminder of a battle survived. Willow Tate had served her time. She had paid the debt the court had demanded. But the sentence Drew had tried to impose. The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that crushes the air out of your lungs. Willow sat frozen, her hands trembling on the table as the judge's words echoed in her ears like a bad dream she couldn't wake up from. For years in Pentonville, the gavel struck, and it was over. The walls seemed to close in, and even the oxygen in the room felt heavy. Michael was standing behind her, his face drained of all color, his jaw clenched tight, but his voice wouldn't come. Drew stood beside her, eyes burning with disbelief, fury, and something else, pain. Willow turned toward him, her eyes red and glossy, barely able to breathe. "For years," she whispered brokenly. "Drew, I didn't mean for this to happen." Drew's throat tightened. His hands curled into fists at his sides as he stared at the judge walking out of the room. "You shouldn't even be here," he muttered, his voice trembling with rage. "You were trying to protect someone else, and now they're sending you to prison." Willow shook her head, tears falling down her cheeks. "It doesn't matter anymore. The judge made up his mind before I even spoke." Michael reached for her, his hand trembling as he touched her shoulder. "We'll appeal this. I swear to you, Willow. This isn't over." But Drew wasn't looking at Michael. He was staring at Willow, searching for something behind those terrified eyes. He had tried so hard to protect her, to keep her away from all this. And now, watching her sink into the nightmare he once lived, it was tearing him apart. When the bailiff approached, Willow's body went rigid. "Please," she whispered to the guard, "I just need a minute." The bailiff looked at Drew, then at the judge's clerk, before finally nodding. 1 minute, he said flatly. Drew stepped closer, his face unreadable now. Willow tried to stand, but her knees almost gave out. Drew caught her, holding her by the arms, and she clung to him like a lifeline. "I'm so sorry," she cried, her voice cracking. "I didn't mean for this to go this far." You thought doing the right thing would protect everyone," Drew interrupted, his voice low and raw. "But sometimes doing the right thing comes with a price, Willow. And it's never fair." Willow's eyes searched his face, desperate for reassurance. "Tell me this isn't forever. Tell me I'll see my kids again. Tell me Michael will be okay." Drew's heart twisted, but he forced himself to look at her. "You'll see them again," he said. "But you're going to have to be strong, stronger than you've ever been. Because Pentonville doesn't care who you are, or how good your heart is. It breaks people." Willow flinched at his words, the memory of Drew's own time in Pentonville flashing through her mind. "You survived it," she said softly. "You made it out." Drew looked away for a long moment. "Yeah," he said finally. "But a part of me never did." The bailiff stepped forward again, signaling that time was up. Willow's tears fell faster now as she tried to steady herself. "Tell Michael, tell him I love him. Tell my kids," her voice cracked completely. Drew reached up, cupping her face gently. "You tell them yourself," he said, trying to sound firm, but his voice broke too. "This isn't the end." But inside, he didn't believe that. He could feel something dark and irreversible settling in his chest. When the guard took Willow's arm and began to lead her away, she turned to look at Drew one last time. Her eyes, wide and pleading, locked on his, silently begging him not to give up on her. Drew watched her disappear through the door, the sound of her footsteps echoing down the hallway like a ghost. When the courtroom emptied, Michael stood in the corner, his head in his hands. "I can't believe this," he muttered. 4 years. How am I supposed to explain this to Wiley? To Amelia? Drew stood still, staring at the empty seat where Willow had been sitting moments ago. His jaw tightened. "You fight," he said finally. "You keep her name out there. You make people see she doesn't belong in that place." Michael nodded, wiping his eyes. "We'll get her out." Drew turned to him, his expression dark. "You better," he said quietly. Because if she doesn't make it back, he couldn't finish the sentence. He just walked out. Outside the courthouse, the air was heavy and humid. Drew stopped at the bottom of the stairs, looking out over the city, his chest rising and falling like he was trying not to explode. Carly approached quietly, her voice soft. "I came as soon as I heard." Drew didn't even look at her. "For years," he said through clenched teeth. "For years for something she didn't do." Carly sighed, crossing her arms. "It's wrong, Drew. Everyone knows it's wrong." Drew finally turned to her, eyes glistening with anger. "Knowing it's wrong doesn't change anything. The system doesn't care. It didn't care when it was me, and it sure as hell doesn't care now." Carly reached out, touching his arm. "You can't carry this on your shoulders." Drew shook his head. "I already am." He stepped back, staring off into the distance, lost in thought. "She trusted me," he said quietly. "She thought I'd protect her. And I promised her I would." Carly's voice softened. "You did everything you could." Drew turned his gaze to her, his eyes cold and hollow. "Then why does it feel like I failed her?" Carly didn't answer. She didn't have to. The silence between them said everything. That night, Drew went to the hospital. The hallways were quiet, dimly lit. He stood outside the chapel for a long time before finally walking in. He sat in the back row, his elbows resting on his knees, staring at the flickering candlelight. "If you're listening," he muttered under his breath, "you owe Willow a miracle. She's been through hell already. She doesn't deserve this." He closed his eyes, remembering the look on her face when the judge read the sentence. The disbelief, the panic, the heartbreak. He had seen that look before, in the mirror, years ago, when his own life had been ripped apart. And now, he couldn't shake the feeling that history was repeating itself. When Michael showed up later that night, he found Drew still there. "I thought you'd gone home," Michael said quietly. Drew didn't look up. "Can't," he muttered. "Every time I close my eyes, I see her walking away in handcuffs." Michael sat beside him, his hands clasped. "I keep thinking, if I had just stopped her, if I had told her to keep quiet, none of this would have happened." Drew's jaw tightened. "Don't do that to yourself. She made her choice because she thought it was right. You can't blame her for that." Michael sighed heavily. "Yeah, but right now, that choice cost her everything." There was a long silence before Drew finally spoke again, his voice low and almost shaking. "You know what hurts the most?" he asked. "That look she gave me before they took her away. Like she thought I'd fix it. Like I had some kind of power to stop it." Michael turned to him. "We'll fix it, Drew. We'll find a way." Drew's eyes darkened. "I've been in that place, Michael. I know what it does to people. It's not just about surviving. It's about losing pieces of yourself day by day. And I don't want her to lose herself in there." Days later, when Drew finally visited Willow in Pentonville, the shock of seeing her behind that glass nearly broke him. She looked pale, thinner already, her eyes hollow but still trying to be brave. She smiled faintly when she saw him. "You came," she whispered. Drew picked up the phone on his side, his voice rough. "Of course I came." Willow bit her lip. "How are the kids?"